You've been conditioned to look for power where it is displayed, where it is declared, where it is publicly confirmed. You were told that without money, without position, without formal authority, you are limited, that your influence is secondary, that you must first obtain something in order to matter. This idea is not accidental. It is convenient for those who already control the structure, because it keeps you in a state of waiting, of asking, of adapting. If power comes from the outside, then its absence is not your responsibility. It is the fault of context, of the system, of the hierarchy. And you remain morally intact but without control. Reality works in the opposite direction. Power appears before it is recognized. Recognition is only a secondary effect, not a cause. In any group at any level, there is a silent process of evaluation, not rational, not verbalized. The body decides before the mind forms conclusions. Who is stable? Who does not react excessively? Who does not rush? Who does not seem driven by visible emotional needs? These signals are read instantly, without words, without analysis. That is why you can see people with titles who are ignored, and people without titles around whom others align. Not because they are more intelligent, not because they are more moral, but because they are not reactive. Because they do not betray their impulses on the surface. Reactivity is a signal of instability, no matter how justified it seems. When someone reacts quickly, defensively, emotionally, they transmit a clear message at a deep level. They can be moved, they can be rushed, they can be provoked, and what can be provoked can be led. Most people live in a state of continuous micro-reaction. They adjust their tone according to others' expressions. They adjust their pace so as not to lose attention. They adjust their words to avoid tension. They adjust their posture to appear more acceptable. This behavior is presented as social intelligence, as empathy, as maturity. From the perspective of real power, it is constant exposure. Whoever regulates the atmosphere for others gives up the center. Whoever feels the need to maintain the group's emotional comfort automatically places themselves in a secondary role, not because they are weak, but because they are occupied with reaction, not position. Dominance without authority begins the moment you stop regulating. Not through direct opposition, not through hostility, but through the absence of reflex, through the refusal to automatically enter the game. When someone says something meant to provoke a reaction and you do not provide it, a gap appears, small, barely perceptible, but that gap creates pressure because the expectation is not satisfied. And the human mind hates gaps. The other person begins to speak more, to explain, to rephrase, to clarify what they meant to say, not because they are inferior, but because their nervous system is seeking stability, seeking a point of support. Every extra word is a surrender of energy. Every explanation is an implicit justification. Every attempt to be understood is a defensive move. You do nothing. And that is precisely what changes the balance. Discomfort is instinctively avoided. People cover it quickly, with laughter, with acceleration, with topic changes, with noise, because discomfort activates the old fear of exclusion, of losing one's position in the group. When you do not participate in this resolution, the pressure remains. It does not explode. It does not become dramatic, but it persists. And persistent pressure produces adjustment. You do not need to appear confident. You do not need to dominate visibly. You do not need to impose anything. It is enough to remain constant, not to rush, not to explain yourself unnecessarily, not to react in order to soothe. Stability is rare, and what is rare becomes a reference point. This is where the first internal destabilization appears. You realize that not every stimulus is a legitimate request, that not every question deserves a complete answer, that not every tension must be diffused. This realization is not comfortable because it brings to the surface a difficult truth. A large part of your previous behavior was dictated by fear. Not obvious fear, not panic, but subtle fear. The fear of being perceived incorrectly, the fear of losing approval, the fear of conflict, the fear of appearing insufficient. These fears operate in the background, and they shape decisions that seem rational but are not. When you stop running from them, they do not disappear instantly, but they weaken, because they are no longer fed by reaction, and along with them disappears the need to prove yourself. You do not become harsher, you do not become cold, you become heavier, denser, less movable. You begin to notice how others move around you, how they adjust their pace, how they become more attentive to your reactions or to their absence, not because you asked for something, but because you did not offer what they expected. This is the first real shift of power, not external, internal. The transition from reaction to position, from impulse to presence, from noise to weight. And once this shift takes place, it cannot be fully undone. Because you have seen the mechanism, and what is seen cannot be unseen. This is where the first stage ends, not with a sense of victory, but with a slightly uncomfortable quiet. A quiet in which you begin to understand how much of human behavior is automatic, how much of it is predictable, and how rarely it is truly chosen. At the moment when this internal withdrawal begins to stabilize, a subtle shift appears in the way you perceive interactions. Not because people become different, but because you no longer enter them from the same place. You are no longer immediately caught. You are no longer absorbed. And this brings to the surface something that was previously covered by noise. You begin to see how much of human behavior is triggered, not chosen. How few reactions are deliberate, how much happens before someone even has time to think. This realization does not make you more indulgent, it makes you more precise. You notice how provocation appears exactly at the moment when someone feels they are losing their position, not their formal position, their psychological position. You notice how sarcasm appears when someone does not have enough weight to confront directly. You notice how jokes appear when tension becomes too great to sustain. Before, these things would have pulled you into the game. You would have responded. You would have corrected. You would have explained. Now, they pass by you, not because you ignore them, but because you recognize them. Recognition changes everything. When you see the mechanism behind the behavior, the content loses its importance. What is said no longer matters. What matters is why it is said, and especially when. This shift creates a distance between stimulus and response. At first, small, almost imperceptible, but enough to stop the automatic reaction. And without automatic reaction, the dynamic changes. People who rely on the reactions of others feel this immediately, not consciously, but physically. To them, you become harder to read, harder to anticipate, harder to influence. Some will try to regain control. They will escalate. They will become more direct, more aggressive, more insistent. Not because they are strong, but because they feel the usual levers no longer work. Others will slow down. They will become more attentive. They will begin to observe you more than express themselves, because they sense they can no longer gain ground through noise. Both reactions are information, and here a subtle trap appears. The desire to use this position, to push, to test, to dominate actively. It is a natural temptation, especially after you have felt the center shift. But this is exactly the mistake that cancels everything. The moment you begin to force, you become reactive again, just on a different level. The moment you try to dominate visibly, you re-enter competition, and competition exposes you. Dominance without authority is not about winning confrontations. It is about no longer needing them. When you no longer seek to win, others feel it, because most are still trapped in the logic of win-lose, and whoever exits this logic appears instinctively more dangerous, not because they attack, but because they cannot be easily pulled. You begin to notice how people want to know where you stand, what you think, what position you hold, but without asking directly. They will launch vague statements. They will test with implications. They will try to provoke you subtly. If you respond clearly and quickly, you give them an anchor. If you respond defensively, you give them leverage. If you do not respond at all, you give them space, and space is uncomfortable. Most will try to fill it. They will talk more, explain more, say things they did not intend to say, because silence forces them to hear themselves. Here, power does not come from what you do. It comes from what you allow to happen. You allow the other person to expose themselves, to rush, to reveal, without pushing them, without provoking them directly. This is a complete reversal of the usual dynamic, because normally people try to present themselves as well as possible, to control themselves, to edit themselves. When you give them enough space, this control weakens, not from weakness, from fatigue. Maintaining a coherent image requires energy. Maintaining a position requires vigilance. When constant feedback disappears, this vigilance becomes difficult to sustain, and then the cracks appear. You do not need to exploit them, only to see them. As this state deepens, something also changes inside you. The need to be validated begins to fade, not because you feel superior, but because you see the validation mechanism itself. You see how transactional it is, how conditional, how temporary. And once you see this, it can no longer be a source of stability. Stability begins to come from elsewhere. From the fact that your reactions are no longer dictated by the outside. From the fact that you are no longer pulled up and down by every interaction. This stability is not visible as enthusiasm. It does not manifest as displayed confidence. It manifests as the absence of fluctuation. When someone praises you, you do not rise. When someone provokes you, you do not fall. When someone ignores you, you do not contract. You remain on the same level. For others, this is unusual, because most are accustomed to controlling through reaction, to raising or lowering someone through emotional stimulation. When this mechanism no longer works, they must adapt. Some cannot, and they move away. Others can, and they align. This is not a moral choice, it is a functional one. At this point, you begin to feel the real weight of silence, not as a lack of words, but as a presence that does not dissolve. And you realize something that is rarely said. Most conflicts are not about real differences. They are about uncontrolled reactions colliding. When your reaction disappears, the conflict is left without fuel, not because you avoided it, but because you did not feed it. This is the second major shift, the transition from internal stability to indirect influence, from the simple absence of reaction to its effect on others. Pressure does not increase through aggression, it increases through clarity, through the fact that others feel they cannot move you easily, that they cannot rush you, that they cannot pull you into their rhythm. And it is exactly this sensation that forces them to reposition themselves, without you asking, without explaining, without raising your voice. This is not yet final dominance, but it is the point at which it becomes inevitable, because once someone has been pulled out of reflex, they cannot fully return to it without feeling the difference. At this point, there is no longer a transition. There is no longer a visible process. There is no longer the feeling that you are learning something, because everything that could be destabilized has already been destabilized. What remains is the bare structure of human interaction, seen without decoration. You no longer participate in the same way, and not because you decided to, but because you can no longer fully return to the old reflex without feeling its artificiality. Interactions are no longer experienced as exchanges, nor as confrontations, nor as subtle games of status. They are predictable sequences, mechanisms that repeat, entries and exits of tension that unfold the same way, regardless of the person. What once seemed complex begins to appear limited. You see intention before words. You see need before the mask. You see impulse before the gesture. Not because you have become more attentive, but because you are no longer emotionally absorbed in the flow. Absorption was what created the illusion of importance. When someone tries to provoke you now, no internal movement appears. There is no impulse to respond that must be suppressed. There is no tension to be managed. The provocation is observed as a standard mechanism, a predictable gesture from someone seeking repositioning. When someone underestimates you, the desire to correct does not arise, because you have already seen this pattern enough times. Underestimation is not an evaluation, it is an attempt at internal regulation on the part of the other. It does not demand a reaction, it only confirms the structure. At this point, emotional reaction begins to be perceived as noise, not as a problem, not as a moral weakness, but as residue of an older, faster, less precise system. Most people still function from this residue, and for them, someone who does not react normally becomes an anomaly. They cannot extract validation, they cannot provoke escalation, they cannot obtain emotional synchronization. This impossibility creates pressure. Some will try to break it through intensity. They will raise their voice. They will accelerate. They will force confrontation. Not because they are strong, but because this is the only language they know. Others will try to move closer, to gain access, to create familiarity, to reduce distance, because they sense stability as something rare and useful. You do nothing in either case, and it is precisely this nothing that becomes decisive, because there is no longer a point of grip. At this stage, the idea of actively dominating disappears completely. It is not rejected, it simply no longer arises, because dominance is no longer an objective. It is already included in your internal position. When you can no longer be rushed, others must slow down. When you can no longer be provoked, others must recalibrate. When you can no longer be pulled emotionally, others lose their usual levers. This creates a silent hierarchy, not declared, not discussed, but stable. People begin to wait for your reaction, or for its absence. They adjust their phrasing, they measure their statements. It becomes visible that the rhythm is no longer theirs, not because you demanded respect, but because they can no longer obtain influence through the old means. Here the final quiet appears, different from the initial quiet. There is no longer tension. There is no longer discomfort. There is density. You no longer feel the need to prove anything, because proving was tied to fear, and fear is no longer your engine. You see clearly how much of social life is built on chain reactions, on people triggering one another, raising and lowering each other emotionally, confusing intensity with importance. When you step out of this chain, you are no longer a link. And what is no longer a link becomes an axis. This is dominance without authority, money, or position. Not because you obtained something, but because you cease to be accessible to others' reflexes. It is not a spectacular state. It does not come with exaltation. It does not come with the feeling of displayed power. It comes with functional detachment. The emotional reactions of others become easy to anticipate, almost monotonous. They no longer attract you. They no longer irritate you. They no longer mobilize you. Not because you are above them, but because you are no longer caught in them. And this is the final point, not a peak, not a victory, but a stabilization. Power was not taken, it was not asked for, it was not negotiated. It appeared exactly at the moment when reaction ceased to be reflex and became irrelevant. From here, there is nothing left to add, because what functions in silence does not need explanation.